you know, this is a 4-part class. So we did the first one 2 weeks ago about gardening methods. If you would like a replay of that and the slides from that, just come grab me after class or write down your name and give it to me. That's even better. Do you need pen and paper too, hon? Yeah, anyone who needs it, just feel free to come grab it. There you go.
We missed you last night.
I know. Awesome. So today what we're going to be talking about is site preparation. So going over what are your goals for this garden season and how to prepare for them, basically. And so taking some time with this site preparation to say, what are my actual goals? Like, is it just to not have to buy tomatoes next year or make some salsa? Is it, or just to reduce my grocery budget, maybe supplement it a little bit, grow some salads from home? But sometimes it's easy to get excited about all these like cool ways you can do things, and then you're like, why do I have so many green beans? I hate green beans. So that's just something to mention as we go through, taking that mindset of keeping my goals as a priority versus getting caught up in other things. So don't overwhelm yourself, having a clear plan with realistic expectations. Before I did the setup for this class, I was looking through all these different gardening books, all these things, just to like, you know, get my mind in the right spot. Every single one of them had an intro saying, be realistic. And so I thought that's just like a little mention for there. So this is a little overview of what we're gonna be going through today. So plant selection, we're gonna be doing a lot more of in 2 weeks from now on April 11th, but we're gonna need to talk about it just a little bit as it's gonna affect how you prepare your site. Now, this is a little showing of that plant selection for us. So chances are, if you've looked at the back of a seed packet, you've seen things like what kind of sun it needs, how deep you should be sowing that seed, and maybe you see that it prefers like very high drainage, or it's okay with being in high waters. So looking at the back of your seed packet, and just especially with plants that you already know you're going to be planting, if you've already had some decisions made, thinking about, okay, I know I need a lot of full sun for my garden. So just like purchasing real estate, gardening is all about your location. You can change and control many things, but the location is kind of where it all starts. So we're going to be going through this a little bit more, saying sun, water, and space. That's the biggest things I'm looking at. If I have any seeds that I'm already planning to grow, sun, water, and space are those main conditions, and they're in that priority order. I can add more water if I need to. I can maybe pull some other plants out or like bunch them in close together, but that sun especially is one of our biggest things. Now, another piece to preparing this, and we're going to talk about this more again next week, is that hardiness. So do you know what zone we're in for our hardiness?
4.
Yeah, so they updated it in 2023 after like 30 plus years of not having updated it. And the generals were saying that we're in technically like 5B or 5A. I would say 4 is, you'd rather give yourself a little extra cushion if we have spots that have high winds, spots that are really bare and could get colder. So 4 is actually, I think, a nice way to look at it, even though it says a 5, just to be safe. Just to be to that point where you're not causing that frostbite. So understanding your yearly frost dates, and then knowing that that's the lowest and highest temperatures those plants are gonna, and if you have animals, those plants and animals are gonna have to tolerate. Now, I have a little link up here that you'll be sent to the slides. This little link is kind of nice because you can put in your zip code, and then it gives you all the plants and what days you might wanna plant indoors or direct sow outdoors, and the date of frost. So you'll get a link to this page, and if you click on that planting calendar by zip code, that underlined, that's a nice little just tool. There's other websites too. That one just has a lot of plants on it, so you can see a lot of different things. Now, mulching your soil, that can prevent heat from being lost, and then that frost settles on top of that mulch rather than on the soil or on your plants. But if the plants are coming out of the mulch, like if you have your daffodils coming up right now and your tulips coming up right now, and there's plants coming out of this mulch, it can also cause them to freeze because you're having air and water get trapped in little pockets sometimes, and then that can lead to that vapor condensing and becoming a frost, like cold air pooling in one spot. So as we're going through, I'll be talking about this a little bit more, about maybe knowing where frost areas to be careful of. And the sun is the biggest piece in that frost. So when you're planning your map, we're gonna be going through the map in just a few slides here, but this idea of south side for everyone in the northern hemisphere, so everyone above the equator, we have the south side is where we get most of our sun. And so in the morning, you're getting sun, and okay, here's another quick question. What side does the sun rise on? East. And then sets in the, there we go. If you forget this, and there are people who don't know this, whatever, I have a little moniker that I came up with that I thought was clever, is it rises in the east like yeast and sets in the west to rest. So that's an original coin, no big deal. But as the sun gradually is moving westward, and the east and the northeast sides start to get that shadow. So you can see in that early afternoon that you're starting to go over to that northeast side for shadow. So ideally, you're facing either south or southeast to get that most sun out of it. Now, also, we're gonna be, I'll get to that next in a second here. So choosing a spot that gets plenty of light. So the sun is a primary consideration for your garden. And most of our vegetables and fruits need at least 8 hours of sunshine, especially for like our tomatoes or cucumbers making these big fruiting bodies. So adequate light on your plants are not gonna thrive. Now, the morning sun with afternoon shade is better than saying I have sun on my southeast side and my southwest side of my house or of my garden bed or whatever it is. I'm gonna maybe tend to give the things that need more sun towards the southeast side versus the southwest side. Does that make sense? Yeah. Because that afternoon sun sometimes is gonna be coming down and giving you that shade, whereas in the morning, then once it's gotten that full day, it gets a chance to kind of go into that nighttime dormancy, where it's saying, okay, just a longer night for it. Now from here, we're gonna talk about wind and rain. So plants, most plants do not like wind. We have talked about this a little, we'll talk about this a little bit more in our seed starting, where you wanna build up a callus, you want them to be resilient to wind and rain. So this is, I thought, a nice little picture of when you have a really dense tree or like, a really old grove of different pine trees and stuff, you can have prevailing winds curving around it and creating multiple directions of wind. So especially when we get like that light fluffy slow, or right after in fall when we're seeing the wind pile up leaves in certain spots, that's a nice way to start to see where is wind actually pushing things around, and where am I seeing the most disruption through the wind. Now, I didn't say this at the very beginning. If you guys have questions at any point on these concepts, just raise your hand and ask it before we forget or move on. So if any of this is kind of like, I get it, but I have things, let me know. Winds of 20 miles per hour are enough to physically cause and break damage. So having ways that you can either block the wind or protect it from wind, especially as we're going into spring with little baby seedlings and start plants, having ways to just protect them, that they can not have such heavy winds. But also, we'll talk about it more, building up that defense system. So on the side here, we also see rain, and something that I don't think ever gets thought about that much is the rain shadow. That idea of when you have winds always going one way against a fence, you can see there's spots where you're rarely ever getting rain because you always have that north or northwest type wind. And then if it's always pushing that way, then you're getting way less rain in that area. And then the area in front of that fence is getting all of the runoff from that. So something just to think about as you're planning, especially landscaping. If you're just doing your square foot garden, maybe this isn't gonna be as relevant, but especially in beds and landscaping wise, this can be really helpful to think about. Now, I took this picture of the daffodils in front of my house yesterday because I thought, oh wow, these are coming up so high. And then I look at the ones in my backyard Well, it's a totally different microclimate down there. They're just barely coming out of the ground down there. So especially when we're near houses or near places that are going to reflect heat, like concrete and asphalt and different places like that, you're going to have warmer climates. So you might have, especially for your perennials, like these daffodil bulbs, they might be coming up a little bit sooner than if they're just in the bed in the way back of your yard, not next to anything that's reflecting heat. So again, just something to kind of think about as we're planning and setting up and thinking about where we want to be putting things. I have this other little photo up here, and you could say the same type of effect is happening if you do like trellises or fences. So if you have like a fenced in area, or if you have a trellised in area where you have the light able to put heat back on it, like the light reflecting off of those trees, that's just another kind of little way that you're storing water, reflecting heat, and changing some of that climate. Now, I have this on here and I gotta mention it. So almost anything can be moved around to where you want it later. So if some plants aren't doing very well in one spot, move them. Don't feel like you're glued to that spot. I had a hibiscus I moved 3 years in a row, which was not good. But now I have it in finally a spot that's like the full sun that it's happy in. But just know that sometimes you gotta be humble and pull out a shovel and say, you know what? I didn't put you in the right place. I'm sorry. So taking those setbacks and knowing that sometimes, yeah, you pulled it back in life. You maybe stressed that plant out a little bit. It's not as full as it was, but now you're having it in a spot that it might flourish a little bit more. And each piece of land is unique. Each design is going to be, every one of you, when you come up with your garden map, is going to be a little bit different depending on not only your land, but so many of these other variables that we're going to talk about. So even though it can seem a little complicated, you're not going to do it wrong. You're going to put stuff in the ground, you're going to plant things, and you're going to keep learning from it every year. So site maps, this is kind of what all of that was leading up to, where you want to be, when you're planning your plants, you want to be thinking about your wind, your rain, and your sunshine. So having on your map your north, south, east, west, that facing for it all, so that you know where your sunshine is going to be going across on it. And then from there also putting in anything that you know is going to be permanent. So like your buildings, your trees, your bushes, your fences, and maybe you put in those perennials if you really think that's the spot, that's where they're at forever. Now, I like doing this and then taking that and either scanning it, putting it on my computer, or making a copy of it, just so that every year I'm not having to remake my baseline for all of the things I want to input in my garden. So this is kind of similar to what exactly mine looks like at home, where I have, the areas balanced out, but then I'll take a copy of this and add in by the square foot where I want to be putting plants in, so that every year I'm not having to recreate where my beds are, where my steps are, where my water catchment is. And I took a line from a book here where it says be realistic, because it's figuring out how much time and energy you can devote to your garden and then starting there, versus thinking I'm going to grow all of my tomatoes for this year, but I'm only going to check on them once a week. Well, unfortunately, water is not always that consistent, and we might have to check on them more often and babysit them. So knowing that I don't want this to be a burden, I want this to be a joy. So if I can only check on them once a week, maybe I either lower my expectation for how much I'm going to get out of it, or bring in some reinforcements, or change what I'm growing, change how much of it I'm growing. So don't overwhelm yourself by planting more of a garden than you can handle, or too far away from your home in extremely challenging growing conditions. Trying to make it fun so you can stay cheerful even when things are challenging. The keeping it close to your home. We talked about this a little bit last week when we talked about permaculture. And I think this is true in all of our lives, where the thing that we are going to do the most is the thing that's easiest and closest. So if I want to have fresh herbs for my dinners at night, guess what? I'm going to have chives, oregano, basil, all these things right outside my back door, as close as I can to my house, so that when it's raining and I still want those chives, I can quick throw on boots, cut a couple off, and run back inside. So these are just principles to think about as you're mapping out is what do I want to eat the most or use the most, or what am I having that I'm going to be able to cut and come back from, like lettuce. You know, like if I want my salad right next to my back door, maybe I have it in a container versus, or maybe I have two of them. Maybe I have one in a container next to my house and one of them back in the beds, and keep checking back on it and see if rabbits are going towards it. Now, gardening journal, you can have your map in your journal. I have like those dot journals. I like those because it's kind of like graph paper in it and you can freeform on those. So those are nice for a gardening journal, but you can put in your schedule, and this is where those frost dates come in hand. So whenever I'm looking at my seed packets, it'll say 8 to 10 weeks before frost, 6 to 8 weeks before frost, you can sow indoors, 2 to 4 weeks before frost, sow indoors. And then I know, okay, so if our frost date is mid-May, sometime, I mean, they say, I think technically May 11th or 13th, but my grandma, I always grew up with her saying Memorial Day is once you're safe. So it's one of those things that depending on the season, depending on the year, you might be able to come out a little earlier or a little later. But in general, having that rough estimate and then planning your calendar backwards. And that way I don't let things slip of, oh yeah, I was gonna plant those zucchini, or I was gonna plant that thing, but now it's way past that date. And then knowing that we're able to direct sow some things that if we didn't start seed beforehand, we can try things later, and maybe they aren't gonna get as big as if we started them from seed beforehand, but we have Ebert's in town, we have a lot of Bypass Farm in town, we have Watertown Greenhouse, we have Roadies in Oconomowoc. We have a lot of great places to go for seedlings all throughout the area, and we have the free seed library at the Watertown Garden Project. We have the free seed library at the library. So there's a lot of resources for us just to know that, hey, I can be going and getting stuff even if I'm going later in the season than what I wanted. But that's me going down a rabbit hole, I'm sorry. So your garden journal should be an ongoing work in progress. So mine has all, last week I showed you guys my garden over the years and how it went from a hill to now these terrace beds. I have the same garden journal as when I started that I just keep adding stuff to and putting things in there. And so having it in sections where maybe you base it on the plants that you're gonna grow in a specific area, maybe you include so just plants that you're growing or just areas that you're specifically looking at, or just go by the year. You say, this is everything I'm doing this year, and then the next year you can look back at it and see, when was I actually planting those tomatoes? When was I amending that soil? So leaving blank pages in your journal, I guess is what I'm saying, leaving room for it to grow and add to. And sometimes it can be like a fun thing to do with kids or grandkids so that you can get them involved and they can make their own little map of stuff. And then you can also put notes in it saying like how much of the supplies it took to maintain a specific area of your yard, especially if you found like, I was weeding every day in this one spot. Well, maybe let's try different plants in that area. Let's try doing different methods for soil amending or mulching. And then saying on here, your fertilizing and amending schedules, your growth time for each plant and crop you planted. So saying again, when I sowed it or when I harvested it, and just putting it on there. And this is a tool if you want to use it. If you're like, I prefer to just throw sunflowers in the air and see what happens, that's okay too. There's chaos gardening too. But this is especially for the people who are like, I always want to see improvement. I keep like challenging myself. So it might not be for everyone. I know for me, I also like just having an album in my phone called Garden. And every year I'm taking photos of my garden and I put it in that album, and then I can look back at it on my phone and see, oh yeah, that's what that bed looked like last May. That's what that bed looked like last April. And that's my no fuss version, no having to like write everything down and remember stuff. And then I'll usually have like a big picture of all my tomatoes and being like, yeah, life is crazy at that moment. Do you have a question?
Hey, I have to ask this question. I was trying to grow celery indoors, just from the stalk.
Yeah.
I've got 3 stalks, but every time I try and put it in my raised garden,
Yeah.
I like goes kaput. Do you have any idea
So,
why?
especially when you're starting in water, it can be really hard for it to move into that soil. So sometimes what I'll tell people to do is, instead of going straight from water to the garden bed, is go to like a really moist sandy soil in your pot, and then once it's starting to get more used to like that that community of everything down below is starting to grow, then maybe take it outdoors and transition. But celery is also a hard one because sometimes it wants to go straight to seed if it's not the right, if it's too hot outside or whatever, just depending on the environment too. So it might have been seasonal things too.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think this is a great activity to also get kids involved with if you wanted to, and it can honestly become like a memory book, like a scrapbook of, yeah, look at them drawing this flower this year and learning things. I also have linked on one of these slides here all of the Biologically Rich, my website, under its education tab, all of our like different programs that are out there for curricula for kids. So if you're interested in getting your kids involved in this or your grandkids involved in this, just know that there's a lot of supportive information out there that is linkable, is available to you. That's free, a lot of it. Yeah, question.
Add some weather information in.
Yes.
What the weather was like, then you know what to blame it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so adding in, well, especially like, okay, last year, I know in my journal I wrote, I'm like, it has been so wet for so long, all through May, it was so wet that it wasn't until like mid-June for a lot of people to put their plants in the ground because they were waiting for their water to infiltrate or run off and whatever. So it's good to be aware of that, just so know that, hey, why did this year go better? Well, maybe it wasn't just me, maybe it was also Mother Nature was just working in a way that worked with my schedule more. And also knowing that in general, we have lots of rain and then no rain, lots of rain and then no rain. So how do I build systems in to catch that and work? So this is me going ahead. We're gonna talk about that in just a little bit. Okay, so the site prep, clearing the land. I have some information stuff back there about like companies that go through and do this where they go and like biochar and just totally do a control burn of an area to basically take it back to the beginning, take it back to base and see what happens. I wanted to show you guys this little video that the Wisconsin DNR put out the other day because, oh, maybe I won't, we'll see.
Burn today. We do these burns of grass every 3 to 7 years just to maintain that grass, and in the woods we'll space that out a little bit longer. We're putting nutrients back in the soil, and there are some plant species, animal species that rely on fire to make their habitat. Otherwise these plants won't grow, they get outcompeted, so this fire helps them maintain their place in the landscape. Before the burn, we're making sure all of our brakes are in, making sure we know where that fire is going to start and stop, and then avoiding any species that are utilizing this grass to be a home. Looks black and burnt now, but I'd say 2 or 3 weeks you're going to start to see that new green growth coming up. By the middle of the growing season, you're going to not be able to tell this was burnt at all, or it's going to look better than the side that wasn't burnt in that case.
All right, the main reason I wanted to tell you guys that is because you can see they're not actually planting a bunch afterwards. And this is something that I have a long time been trying to even comprehend is how many seeds are dormant in the ground everywhere always. And they are just waiting for the right conditions for them to germinate. So like in prairie landscapes like this, you'll see some plants that they haven't seen before because now they're going back in succession and kind of taking it to an environment that now those seeds are germinating for the first time. And you'll see this with like pastures as well, where a farmer who takes a corn and soy field and then plants grasses and then has animals going through it, eventually they start to see grasses that they never planted because they were in that seed bank. There's hundreds of seeds in the ground below us that are just dormant waiting for those right conditions to come out. So sometimes that's exciting and encouraging to think about, even with like endangered species and stuff, where it's like, okay, have we really lost all hope? Or maybe is there some out there that are just dormant and they're waiting for us to finally keep healing our soils and our earth versus, you know, tilling it up, putting down chemicals and thinking that man's gonna fix the solution. No, nature has a design that's far greater than ours. So that's just one way that people have used to kind of clear their landscape that I thought is interesting to look at. Now, a way that a lot of us will probably end up doing it is with like cardboard or using like black tarping and putting that down. So this to me is the most economical way and the most feasible way. I don't have to have some fancy torch or anything or have to wait for the right conditions. I can take cardboard and I overlap it so that there's no sun coming through, because that sunshine is again making that environment for the seed to germinate. and for that seed to grow. That's basically what I mean by germinate. So using 2 layers of cardboard is almost what I would recommend, but having them all overlapping. And what's nice is once you start to soak them, or once you wet them down, they're able to kind of like bend and fold. So if you're having them going around curves, or if you have them going around plants that you already have in that area, it's kind of a nice way to just cover that land and show how much space it's taking up. So you can see down here they have like soil, and then they have weeds and grass, and then they have cardboard. And then after that cardboard is soaked and down, they'll add on their compost, they'll add on their topsoil things, and then mulch, which you could use straw, bark, wood chip, leaves, all your dead plant materials. So leaves, yes, you can use leaves as a mulch. You can use it all is up to your preference. You know, for someone who's got a really nice curated lawn in a, you know, subdivision, maybe you want to always have wood chip just so you stay with that uniformity. But especially if you're like, for me, I try to do kind of like cottage, where I have a ton of flowers growing really densely. So for me to have leaf debris down below, it's going to get covered with flowers. Whereas if you're doing a very like sculpted lawn, maybe you end up just using wood chip for your mulching. Now, a little hack that I think is a nice way to do it is using a hose to outline where you want your space to be. So this is, again, if you're using like garden beds and landscaping. But if you're doing square foot gardening or traditional row type gardening, this is still a nice way to kind of just visualize what is actually the amount of space I want to use on my garden. Because you might say, I want a 4x4, I want a 4x8 bed. But then when you put that hose line out and measure out that 4x8 space, you might be like, oh, that's going into the ditch, or oh, that's going, gonna be on a big steep hill. And it just helps you maybe troubleshoot some things before you get too far ahead of yourself. Another thing I'll use in, I don't know why that picture's not showing up for it, but the use of pots, where I'll put, like if I have a nice tall pot, or even a box on that for that case, and I know I'm growing stuff that's taller, just seeing where it is with that sunshine during the day, seeing where it is with the wind. If my stuff is looking already like it's gonna be too high in the sky, especially if I'm doing like a raised bed that's above ground, and then I put in a 4 foot, which is maybe how tall my tomatoes are gonna get, and then I realize, oh, maybe I need to do my tomatoes in a shorter pot, or maybe I need to do my trellising lower down in different areas. So using pots, using your hose, using whatever you want to try to help you just visualize your space before investing in and tearing everything up.
Angie,
Yeah.
how soon would you suggest laying the cardboard down for the site prep, because you're trying to kill grass or whatever?
I would do it as soon as you know. So like as soon as you know your area, put it down. You can stake it down with like landscape stakes, or you can use even a 4-inch nail is going to be enough to hold it down for the season here. But I like using like tent stakes, just because I can see it and pull it out afterwards. And once it's decomposed and I have stuff on top of it, I can pull those stakes right out. So.
What about how long does it take for that to die off to be able to actually plant?
It sort of depends on if we have a lot of heat. It'll happen pretty quickly, where it'll bake it almost. But if it's really like mild climates throughout and rainy throughout, it might be one that you'll peel up and you'll see, oh, it's still grass under that. Which honestly, it's okay if you're seeing that, as long as you have it all overlapped and covered, and then you're continuing to add on top. So, and like anything, it's never going to be totally perfect, but seeing the space beforehand and then getting it covered as soon as you know, okay, this is where it's gonna be. I'm gonna start layering up and you can do that, we talked about the lasagna method 2 weeks ago. You could do that lasagna method as soon as you put that cardboard down. You don't necessarily need to wait for it to all be died off afterwards. Now, the pathways in between in your garden, how many of you guys already have pathways in your garden? Yeah. Do you use like grass for them mainly? And mow it? What do you guys use?
Yeah.
Mulch, leaves? Yep. So I thought this idea down at the bottom was a brilliant one, where you use pine cones, because especially those softer, smoother ones, I don't know about you guys, but I have family they would pay me to take their pine cones. So to have that as a little like path, I thought brilliant. But then I'll see people too who will take, you know, slabs of wood, put that down, using rock or yard waste. There are often times where our yard waste you can get free pavers because a landscape project was just tossing them and whatever. So that's a nice free option for you to just have stepping stones in between, because once you have your, say you've done your cardboard, you've done your lasagna method, but it's a bigger place that you can't get to the center, or like you can't get all the way into the middle, having some pavers in between as your like stepping stones to get to those other areas of your garden is a nice option. Yeah.
Angie, what is a lasagna method?
Yeah, no, it's okay. So, you know how this idea of cardboard, compost, mulch, like these layering,
Yeah.
it's that same concept of adding in a diversity of different materials. So maybe it's compost and then a bunch of leaf mold and then some wood chip or at the top, and so just adding in different layers. Yeah. So the only other little thing I want to mention with wood is if you are using like, say, old pallets or wood that's like just straight line, maybe you cover it with like linseed oil or paint it, because that you might get splinters eventually with that stuff and it'll splinter up. So if it's not treated and you're using like this little idea of straight line wood, just try and keep it sealed in some way so that you're not getting, you know, a kid crying because they got a splinter in their toe. Now, soil amendments, there are a lot of amazing places in Wisconsin or in the Midwest that are working on building rich compost. So I would, if there's one page I want you guys to come back to and click on a link, it's this resources page, because that's gonna link you to my website where I show all these different soil amendment companies. So like Blue Ribbon Organics, Lush Farms, there's Bag and Bulk is a big one out in Watertown here that you can buy by the cubic yard. And so there's also places like Ebert's that sell those amendments that they're gonna be there in the moment when you pick up the bag to talk to you about it. So I actually do like going to Ebert's to look at their soil amendments, because in general there might be someone there who I can talk to about it. Something I didn't write on here that I've mentioned before in my classes is OMRI, O-M-R-I. That's a nice label to see on your compost or on your amendments, just because it's kind of like an organic label. It's kind of like saying, hey, this has been tested to make sure that it's not gonna be of more harm than benefit to your plant and not gonna just be another chemical you're throwing on. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If you're amending soil, but you have, like for instance, I have 3 raised beds that are annuals.
Mm-hmm.
Rhubarb, you know, asparagus and strawberries.
Yeah.
How do I amend it then? I mean, you're just laying it on top of that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I should have maybe talked about that more on here. So when I do amendments, you can either do it in a couple different manners. You can do it as a top dressing, like you lift up especially for like rhubarb and things that are gonna be gone for a while, you can use it as a top dressing over the top, and then, or maybe pull your mulch away, whatever your leaf litter away, use it as a top dressing, and then put that leaf litter, your mulch back on. You can also use it with, like my favorite is usually like a paint strainer bag or a laundry bag, something where you can put that compost in it and then take a 5-gallon bucket of water and shake it out like a washerwoman and pull out all of those good microbes from it, especially for things that are like, exactly, and then you use that water as an above ground like soil drench right before a rain, especially. That's a great way a great time to do it, because the rain's gonna do the hard work of making those infiltrate down then for you. So we're gonna talk about that a lot in our last class, where we're gonna talk about weeds, pests, and disease, because that's, to me, instead of just looking at fertilizer or pesticide or herbicides as my only solutions, compost extracts, that's kind of what that is where you're extracting all the good stuff in the compost and then putting it in your watering can and pouring that on. That's a really nice way to just introduce all these beneficial things that are that should be in our soils to cycle the nutrient to your plants, which I'm gonna show another little picture about this in the future here. But yeah, I point out on here peat. In most soil mixes, peat is like 40+% of the mix in general on average. There's lots of variability to that, but peat can sometimes be considered controversial because you do have to dig deep to get this resource. So it's a dark humus kind of color. So there's like some more conservation type sources of it where we'll work with construction companies and stuff, but just know that peat is a really great additive for your soil, and it can sometimes be, you know, not the thing that you want to be buying a ton of all the time because it is such a limited resource in our, I shouldn't say limited, but controversial resource in our gardening world. Now these different meals I have on here: feather meal, blood meal, bone meal, oyster shells, lime, fish and bone meal, so, and kelp. Those are all things that are high nitrogen. So it's also under that resource tab. So I write on here, be cautious with some of those amendments, because if you go too strong on some amendments, it can burn your plant and it can cause you more costs than good. So that's where, especially for any of those higher nitrogen things, I'm less than 10%. I'd much rather do a little bit and not see too much, and then add a tiny bit more over the next week or 2 weeks, versus, oh, my plant it's gonna need a lot of help, so I'm gonna put down more and think that more is better. So less is actually better with some of these fertilizers. And honestly, with most of our fertility treatments, just working with different greenhouses and stuff in the area, you find that they will have way more issues if they over fertilize than if they under fertilize. So over fertilizing is just something to be really cautious of. And again, doing it once, doing a lighter application of it, and then giving it 2 weeks. I would say 1 to 2 weeks is a good kind of timeline to say, what are the effects? What are the effects of that application? And then this organic compost, mushroom compost, worm castings, those are all things that if I put on too much, it's not gonna be a problem. If I put on 100% beautiful worm mushroom compost on my garden, guess what? My plants are gonna love it, and it's not gonna hurt a thing. So those are things that if I'm, say I got my 11% off at Menards and I'm looking at their mushroom compost or whatever, or doing some of these other higher nitrogen kelp meal stuff, maybe I spend it on the extra bag of the mushroom compost. Or the other thing is, everyone is gonna say they're the best. Everybody is gonna say, oh yeah, this is beautiful compost. I go through and work with a lot of different compost companies to assess the quality of it, because compost technically should be all sorts of living things in rich abundance. So when you say you have compost, but all I see is bacteria, that's not compost. That's just like putrefied organic stuff. So I great time for Dawn to come in. Yeah, what's your question?
Talking about compost.
Yeah.
We have our own composting unit that we use, and we take all the leaves from the trees and whatever and put it in. Now, do you add anything to that to make it break down faster?
So 2 big things I think about with that are, my food scraps are all technically green materials. They're a little bit higher nitrogen than they are carbon. So 2 things I add is moisture, to make sure that there is like not just dried out food scraps, but moisture to it. But then every time I'm putting food scraps on my compost, I'm also adding shredded paper, newspaper, toilet paper rolls, shredded mail, anything that's not like plastic, anything that is actual like dead tree paper. I'll add that to my compost pile, because that's my brown. And in order for me to have my green breakdown, I have to have brown with it. So browns and greens in compost, we're gonna be talking about that a lot more on our fourth session. So I'm not gonna go too much deeper into it, but that's the idea, is balance. And with everything in nature, there's this Goldilocks principle, this idea of too much or too little. Like we were saying before with the rain, you can have too much rain, or you can, same with us. I could have too much water, I could drown. I have too little water, I dehydrate and die. So there's the balance of it all, and that's with the composting especially. I just wanted to quick throw this in here. We're gonna repeat this slide on that in that 4th week too, but I thought this is such a cool way to do some in-ground, really passive composting, even if you just have a little raised bed. So what they did, and I did this with a cardboard box. You don't have to necessarily do this with the terracotta. She soaks the terracotta and then like pokes holes in it. But basically you put down a little bit of your soil, you put down a little bit of like shredded paper and stuff, and then you put in some of your food scraps. And guess what comes? Worms. Worms come through these different holes in that terracotta pot, and they do that composting for you. So to section off maybe 1 of your square feet in your square foot garden for compost, something to experiment with, something to think about. Especially when you think we all have food scraps. How can I efficiently, passively, not stinkily, sorry, be able to do that? Did you have a question?
Do you just leave that, or do you take something in there and mix,
Worms are doing all the
just
mixing.
leave it?
So cool fact about worms, they eat everything that fits in their mouth. So they're just walking through their soil, eating everything that comes in their mouth, and then anything that doesn't get processed comes out as a worm casting. So that's where you're getting at the end. You literally, if I were to put some food scraps in, put in some, soil and other stuff, like leaf mold, whatever, and then come back in 3 months, it actually will be like perfectly leveled with castings because they leave it perfectly level. That said, if the food's gone, they leave. If I let it dry, if it gets really dry and whatever, they leave. So that's the other cool part about doing it in ground is you're getting that moisture level stabilized versus trying to just have a worm bin above ground. Yeah.
I've heard that you shouldn't use meat.
Yeah. So meats, dairies, breads, those are all so high in like nitrogen that you're gonna get fleas and things that can be stinky because that high nitrogen, when it starts to decompose, when you have these things, these microscopic things eating it, they can't absorb all that nitrogen, and the nitrogen they can't absorb goes off as a gas, and that gas usually smells like ammonia. It is ammonia. It is literally nitrogen in the air. So when you smell like rotting eggs and all that stuff, that is the nitrogen from those high nitrogen sources going off in the air. Because if you do put those things in, you need a lot of carbon. You need a lot of brown to cover them so that they can decompose without letting that nitrogen go off in the air. So that's kind of the reasoning. So there is ways to do that, but composting is my other love language. So we'll talk about that on the 4th week. I could talk about this for a long time, but I just wanted to mention it as far as site prep. Maybe you would take a tiny little spot in your garden and prepare a little spot to do a compost experiment where you put some of your food scraps in there. So I'll be talking about this more in a little bit. This is another way that people do it where they just take like a 5-gallon bucket, and as long as you drill holes as big as a worm, so like a 1/2-inch hole or a centimeter hole, then they can go in and out. And then there's all these worms in the bottom of my bucket, like chowing down on this like apple core or whatever it was. Yeah. So kind of cool. I think it's cool. Now last time we talked about trellising a little bit as a gardening method, and I think we maybe want to talk about that more because it's one of the most infrastructure, with it. So I actually took these pictures at a garden I was working at in a home I was helping out at in Waukesha, and they did this kind of cool system of building just a frame and then putting in string, just putting in twine, and that way the next year, they'll have to restring it, but their cleanup was just cutting it down and then decomposing it in their compost versus it's easy to use like tomato cages and lots of metal and plastic and all these things that if it's windy and flies away, now I left my stuff in someone else's yard and it's never gonna break down. So having some biodegradable type resources for your trellising is nice. So I like using like twines and strings, and this is kind of labor intensive to do that mesh with it. This is kind of easy because I'm just going back and forth, up and down, and then pinning to the sideline, pinning down to there's a little PVC at the bottom, or they actually I think use a piece of wood at the bottom. So they just wind back up and down. And that A-frame stays out there year round. So that's something to think about if you want to try trellising that way. There's also in the corner here, like, I'm doing this with some old sunflower stalks this year, where I take my sunflower stalks and go back and forth, and then you can use some of that stringing up. Now, there's so many ways to trellis. This is where I had to say when, because I could be showing you, like, you know, where you're having horizontal supports versus vertical supports, and that way they're building up to that. Or like if you're growing some really, like your peonies or your dahlias, or you're growing these really big, heavy flowering plants, maybe you add trellising just as support for those flowers. So it really does vary on what you have available to you, what space you have available to you, and what you want aesthetically. Because maybe you're like, that looks messy, Angie, I don't want that. So maybe you do more of that cattle panel, like what we had talked about the other week, where it's those 4x4 section panels. That's the thing is, it's a little bit labor intensive if you want to move that, whereas this is a lot less labor intensive to move. Do you guys have questions about trellising though? I just wanted to throw that out there because I thought it was an important thing to talk about when you're planning.
We did something neat last year. We put, instead of trellising that you built, we put our sweet corn, we have a large garden, we put our sweet corn like in a circle, like maybe 4 or 5 stalks in a circle. And then once the sweet corn was up about this far, we planted our climbing beans, our climbing green beans. And the climbing green beans grew up on my sweet corn, and it was really an easy thing to pick.
Yes.
Because
So have you heard of Three Sisters? That is, yeah, so that's like a kind of a version of Three Sisters where you're using the 2 of them. So that is something like all through like Native American heritage, you see some of that being talked about, where the third one is like squash usually at the very bottom. So after your,
pumpkin stuff.
yeah, so perfect, yeah. And especially if you're already saying like amaranth, that's like a type of flower if you want to try growing that, and it's a gorgeous flower on it as well, like actual bloom on it versus the rye of it. But that's another thing that you could use for your stalk, just like your corn. Same with sunflowers. You could use your sunflowers as your stalk. The only thing is, like you said, you had to wait until it's already kind of built up, so you have to think about that with your garden schedule, saying, okay, maybe I'm right away making sure I have my corn or my sunflowers or my amaranth out there early June, May, get it right away, and then by mid-June, that's when I'm putting out. Was that kind of what you guys ended up doing?
I
Or
don't think it was mid-June, it was,
like early June?
yeah.
Yep, so just having that little bit of difference though to have it catch up. That's a great point though, Kathy.
And you don't have to take it down.
Yeah, and we're gonna talk about fall here in just a second, but for everyone, it's gonna be different. If you have really busy falls, which I do, I find I put more of my work in my spring, but we'll talk about that in a second. Now, water is the single most important resource for the survival of not only us, but also for your plants. This is kind of a neat system that is, again, kind of a traditional use. Have you heard of an Olla? O-L-L-A. So this has been used in like Mexico and throughout Native Americans as well. But basically, it's that idea of a terracotta pot being buried in the ground and then water being filled in it, and that water slowly wicking away. And then roots, because roots can sense where water is, they move towards the pot. They move towards that. So especially if you're worried about keeping up on watering, or if you're worried about like trying to balance out when you're going on a vacation or something, that's a nice little tool. And really, I could use a terracotta pot and just cover it, as long as I'm not letting that evaporation happen. This is just a nice way because it's already got that closure at the top that even adds to that not evaporating. Now,
Angie?
yeah.
I'm sorry, the terracotta, like you're not drilling holes in that because
No,
the
it's
clay
wicking
will-
out. Yeah, that clay
So
is.
you fill it with water and your soil will take up the.
It's a really slow way to do it. I like a slow removal. So it's a cool, and I kind of think underrated self-sufficiency hack. So I mean, there's other things out there too that are similar to this, but that's the concept, is that idea of having stuff in the ground to redo. Now, rain barrels. There's actually, I think, going to be a workshop soon at the Parks and Rec Department to do a rain barrel. I would totally recommend, if you have a roof that you can collect rain from, try collecting rain from it, because for every 1,000 square feet of roof, you can have 600 gallons of water per inch of rain. So if we get 1 inch of rain and you have a 1,000 square foot house, that's 600 gallons of water. That's like, what is this, a 50-gallon drum? So just think of how much water we have run off. And then you think about our parking lots and everywhere else, and it's like, oh my gosh. Sorry, go ahead.
No, my husband started with that, collecting with the rain barrels. He had friends that could get him the big barrels, like beer soda companies.
Yes, WizPack is the one who's providing it for Parks and Rec.
Yeah, and so we've got like, is it 15 or 20 barrels between our garden? We have a pretty good sized yard. Barrel, we have 3 in the front on each side. We have,
So everyone's getting her address when we have a drought. She has got us hooked up. I love it. That's amazing. Yeah.
I built a water catcher, a rain catcher,
Mm-hmm.
with a 275 gallon food safe unit for my
Yeah.
cabin. So we collect that. I built the off the gutters.
Yeah.
Comes off the gutters and
Yeah.
where's like that. So we use that for whatever when we're at our cabin.
Nice. Well, and the only thing with the food safe, like the big IBC totes and stuff, is when it's clear, just be mindful of like algae and bacteria growth, because that sunlight can sometimes affect,
Well,
well,
that's
it
what-
does affect that.
When we first did it, it did get full of algae, but we took
Okay.
and dumped bleach in it
Okay.
to clean it out,
Yeah.
and then it works fine after that.
Nice. Okay. And like I know sometimes people will have like a tote like that, and then they'll either just paint it or cover it in some way. So if you're happen to have one of those clear type totes, then that's just a way that you can use it. So, but I love that, and it's especially when you're up north, that's huge to have nice clean water for even just washing up dishes and stuff. This is some other cool self-watering little hacks, and we're talking about site prep today. I know for my father's definitely like the main gardener in my life who I've learned from, and he has had so many different watering apparatuses, shall I say. So like this is a way that they had it where they did in ground before your planting season and stuff. They did in the ground where they had, so you have one thing that you're turning on, and then each bed had this drip irrigation up on the top there. You can see there's a drip line that they put out, and then that connection piece is in the PVC. Now, the hard part is then at the end of the year, you gotta take either an air compressor and have like a hose attachment to it, or make sure that those lines are dry, because it's Wisconsin and it freezes. Otherwise, bury them like 3 feet down, but that's a lot of extra work. So that's something to think about. There's also these little, and you could totally hack this. You could totally make your own version of like a PVC pipe with some holes in it and a deep pot, or doing where you have two pots on top of each other and you drilled out holes at the bottom. This is like a fancy official version of that, this grow box. But that's basically what they have, is they have one pot with all their water retention, and then the next pot to hold up their soil so it's not just sitting and waterlogged. So that's kind of just a cool idea that I think it's fun to experiment with. If you want to learn more about that PVC watering system too, there's links for that on the slides that you're going to get. Now, we were talking a little bit before about like what you do in the fall and what you do in the spring. Like, hey, yeah, I had these beans grow up this corn and now I don't gotta cut it down at all. And so there's benefits in both ways. Like if I clean up my fall stuff, maybe I might have to worry about like bugs or certain pests and disease that are gonna maybe make a home in underneath my leaf litter. That said, it could also be helping you recycle nutrients if you leave all your above ground from the fall growth. If you leave all that fall plant matter, you can also get better moisture retention, reduce erosion, and provide habitats for overwintering insects. And so that's where those overwintering insects, it could, in general, I'm always a lazy fall person, and I'll clean up in spring just because we're dealing with so much more harvest at that time too, and holidays are coming, I'm already stressed. But it's also nice because I'm feeding all these microbes and stuff, and now, so I showed you guys that picture of my daffodils earlier. If I pull up any of that leaf litter, there's gorgeous, moist soil underneath it. Whereas the areas where there's no leaf litter, it is just dry and barren in those spots. So keeping the ground covered is really a nice way to just set yourself up for your spring. Another thing that you can play with if you'd like to is that idea of when you have roots in the ground, you're feeding all of that population below ground. So that's where you'll see farmers growing like winter rye, wheat, even daikon radish, because they know that even if I'm not harvesting that crop is leading the fertility of the plant that I want to harvest, because you're feeding that soil, all of these little things that are alive in the ground below you. So knowing that when I have this above ground ecosystem staying there versus just wiping it out and clearing the area, it's feeding so many different networks of things beyond what I can imagine. One thing that I said last time, and I'll say it again this time, is anything from pesticide to homicide, ending in "-icide", means to kill. And when I kill off this one pest or this one fungus or this one thing, there's so many relationships within it that chances are for the one problem I'm killing, I might be killing 1,000 other beneficials. So learning, we're going to be talking about this a ton in the 4th class, that idea of inhibit, compete, consume. That idea of I'm going to overwhelm with beneficials, that any problems that I'm starting to get, I'm going to try to inhibit them by either washing them off with brush air or competing with them with all these beneficials or consuming them. So we're going to talk about that a bunch in the future here. But when you are done with your fall, you can either leave the above ground, or you can do what they call like the chop and drop method, where you take any of those above ground, like say I have my beanstalk or whatever, maybe I either chop it down into small pieces and use it like a mulch, or I put it into my compost pile right away, or I send it off to yard waste and they compost it. But that's a nice way to take all of that above ground organic matter, which can be feeding that soil down below, and chopping it up and reutilizing it, following that cycle that Mother Nature has designed. So keeping the roots in the ground. There's this farmer, Gabe Brown, he works with the USDA and goes around to all these different farmers. And one thing he said is roots are like scaffolding in your soil. They're creating this structure. So when you have all of these roots from your previous year still in the ground, sometimes you think, oh, is this gonna like inhibit it or compete with it? But I look at it as another food source for all of the microbes that are gonna be feeding your plant. So keeping the soil with all of the roots in the ground, and then just opening up in the areas where you're gonna be planting. And this might not be your case if you have really compacted soils. So if this is land that you've never planted on before, or you planted on and every year have tilled it up and whatever, maybe this year you till it up one last time, and then you add in those soil amendments, and then you get that ground covered. You get it covered with either fast growing ground cover or all the different plants that you're wanting to plant, or even just clover or alfalfa or winter rye or all of those cover crops that I just mentioned too. So getting that ground covered afterwards to, again, get that scaffolding, get that structure built up, and then never having to till again. And then when you are ready to cultivate that land, you're only opening up the areas where you're planting versus ripping up all the soil around it. I know that's kind of a hard concept, especially for like a farmer to go to no-till and have their whole livelihood change over when they've tilled their farm every year. So even for us as gardeners, that can feel super wrong and foreign. So maybe you don't do it everywhere, you just try it in one area, but try it in maybe one of your beds, or even just a couple of your square feet of your garden where you don't totally till it up and you just open up where you're planting and keeping that leaf litter on top. But eventually, ideally, what you're doing is just kind of fluffing, just opening up in those areas and then planting, and then your plant, those roots, as long as you don't have really bad clay compaction, those roots are gonna be able to penetrate. So they say 100 PSI, which if I can't even push my shovel through the ground, chances are that's like 100 PSI, then you're gonna not be able to get your root through the ground. And maybe you can through a root crop. Maybe you can through like a daikon radish or a turnip or beets, any of those root crops that they get big in the ground and they help it expand. So they help crack open that compaction. So if you are dealing with that kind of stuff, that's a tool. You can use that plant as a tool, any of those root crops, to help open up those compaction layers. But then I talk about that chop and drop method too down here. So if I'm not doing that in the fall, then I'm probably gonna do that in the spring, right before I plant. Like at my house, I gotta do that right now, where I'm chopping up all of my above ground and then getting it ready for that spring so that I'm not having, just a bunch of dead plants all around my growing living stuff. That said, like for my stalks, I kind of save them because you never know when you're gonna want something to prop up or, plant against, so. But that's me being super frugal and weird, so you can do whatever you want with that. Now, the tools that you will need, we're gonna talk about a lot more different tools if you wanna do seeds indoors with our plant selection class, but in general, gloves is like I don't wanna say a non-negotiable, you can go without gloves, but your hands get really dry when you're working with soil, and as much as it's good to feel the ground and get those microbes on your skin and breathe it in, get it real close to your face, your hands can get really dry with just moisture on them all the time, and your soil should have moisture. So I usually wear just like cotton gloves or whatever and have multiple pairs of them, and then just like change out if they're still wet or whatever, but you find what feels good for you. And then pruning shears, they're also called like secateurs. That's something that when you get to a point of having your plants in the ground, you're gonna want them eventually. Or for that chop and drop, you can also use the loppers, which those are those big shears. But just having these things, you probably already have this stuff at home and you're like, yeah, that's fine. Also, as far as storing, like a hand trowel, a spade, pruning shears, all of those metal things that I, in general, will tell people go towards like a stainless steel head because you have less rust with it. Also, sand with oil in it is a nice way to like I have a bucket at home where I have just sand, and that's where all of my tools go into, because then it just keeps them sharp, keeps them out of the ability to get moisture on them and stuff. So that's a nice little hint for you. And then hand trowel, like again, that stainless steel head, spade. Longer handles are gonna have more leverage and they're heavier. So like when I showed you guys my backyard and I was just digging for my life for years, every single time was a long handle. That said, when my husband got to the point where he was grading and doing like the fine work, he used a shorter handle and a flat side to it. So shovels do have different tools to them. Oh no. Okay. Well, there we go. I think the thing just told me I was done. That cut me off.